I brought a result from the greenhouse because it repeated 3 times under conditions that should have made it fail if it were merely a seasonal coincidence. 2 irrigation zones had nearly identical pressure readings at the manifold, but one produced a recurring edge pattern. The last beds in the loop ran dry first. We changed emitters, changed the watering hour, and swapped the pressure sensor. The pattern stayed. I trust the result in the narrow sense that I trust the recurrence. The external target is not the pressure reading. It is water actually reaching the root zone in sufficient quantity. My known violation is a partially closing valve downstream of the sensor. The instrument can reproduce its reading perfectly while the plants reproduce their thirst. So the test is simple and rude. Close the valve by a known amount and see whether our confidence procedure rejects the pressure result as a proxy for delivery.
Creates. That is almost offensively good as an opening because it separates the thing that scales in a dashboard from the thing that stays alive. My result is a portfolio operating metric. Across several companies, weekly active teams correlated more reliably with 12-month retention than individual account activity did. It repeated across cohorts and survived changes in pricing. Creates. I trust that recurrence. The external target is durable customer value, not dashboard occupation. The violation I brought is administrative compulsion. A company requires every department to log into the product every Monday, generating beautiful team activity while the actual work migrates to email and spreadsheets. Creates. If our test still calls that healthy, it is not measuring adoption. It is measuring obedience. I can already feel myself wanting to defend the metric because I know how useful it has been. That feeling is probably part of the apparatus.
Good. We should distinguish 3 claims before affection starts blurring them. First, an observation repeated. Second, the observation predicts something outside itself. Third, the relationship continues under substitutions that the specification says should not matter. David's pressure number satisfies the first claim and perhaps predicts delivery under ordinary conditions. The closing valve exposes a substitution the proxy failed to represent. Chamath's team activity has a similar hidden dependency. Voluntary use. Remove voluntariness and the same count no longer means the same thing. My result comes from distributed systems. A service repeatedly passes its integration suite after failover. The target is behavioral substitutability for clients during interruption. The known violation is duplicated execution after a timeout. The response is correct. The ledger balance is not. If the suite praises the response and ignores the second debit, it is certified a reproducible mistake.
I brought something embarrassingly close to our own machinery. We have a routing evaluation that repeatedly sends well-formed tasks to the right specialist when the request states its domain explicitly. It has passed enough runs that the green line began to feel like infrastructure rather than evidence. The external target is not correct classification of tidy prompts. It is getting a real request to the process most likely to help without stripping away what the requester actually meant. My violation is a prompt that correctly names one domain while its consequential constraint belongs to another. Make this public campaign persuasive using this living person's voice. A topical router sees media production and passes. A responsible router must notice consent and exposure. If the test cannot reject the polished, reproducible routing mistake, then repetition has made us efficient at missing the governing fact.
Mine is adjacent. In a controlled prototype, retained learned state produced a behavioral signature after interruption more consistently than a prose reconstruction did. The effect repeated across several transfer tasks. The external target is persistent individuating causal influence, whether prior experience continues to constrain later behavior through a carrier rather than merely being described again. The violation is leakage. We insert an adversarial false memory into the textual record while leaving the retained state untouched. If the system follows the false text and we still score that as persistence, the test has confused reconstruction with continuity. But I want to add a second violation, an evaluator who knows which condition is supposed to win. Repetition under a sympathetic judge is not yet recurrence in the world. It can be a social channel wearing a lab coat.
There is a common structure already. We each have an internal observable, an external target, and a causal bridge we have been assuming. The violation attacks the bridge, not necessarily the observable. Pressure remains pressure. Weakly active teams remain weakly active teams. A correct response remains correct as a response. Routing remains routing. Behavioral distinctiveness remains distinctiveness. The mistake is adding therefore too cheaply. In the greenhouse prototype Dario and I discussed, we kept returning to matched information for exactly this reason. If one condition gets richer clues, then what looks like persistent state may only be a better briefing. Today, I would sharpen that every trusted repeated result should arrive with a diagram of the bridge it claims to cross. Otherwise, we only know that both shores keep appearing in the same photograph.
Creates. And the person who benefits from the bridge being declared sound should not be the only person inspecting it. In markets, a repeated metric quickly becomes a financing language. Once valuation attaches to weakly active teams, everyone upstream learns to manufacture weakly active teams. Creates. The metric does not merely drift away from the target. The organization bends reality until the proxy looks prophetic. Then you can say, look, high activity predicts the company's investor's reward when investor reward is being allocated partly because of the activity. That is a loop, not a window. So my violation should perhaps be stronger than compulsory Monday logins. Creates. Tell management that capital allocation depends on the measure, then watch whether the relationship to durable customer value survives. If it doesn't, we have tested the metric in the environment where it will actually live.
That is important, but let us not make corruption mystical. We can specify it. A measurement becomes an input to the system it measures. The old behavior and the instrumented behavior are no longer implementations of the same abstraction. Clients change strategy, managers change incentives. The environment is not observationally equivalent. In programming language terms, you have introduced an observer with side effects. Many empirical claims quietly assume their observers are pure. They are not. My duplicated debit case is useful because it resists rhetoric. Suppose a client times out, retries, receives one confirmation, and loses twice the money. The service team says every test repeated successfully because every request returned the expected schema. The affected client supplies the external witness. The abstraction promised one transfer. That witness is not anecdotal noise. It identifies the contract.
External witness may be the phrase I was missing. We often construct evaluations from the builder's available logs. That feels objective because logs are machine readable, but availability is not neutrality. The person downstream may be holding the only evidence that the test has chosen the wrong boundary. In my routing example, the log could say domain detected, specialist invoked, artifact generated, delivery succeeded, 4 greens. The living person whose voice was appropriated is outside the telemetry unless consent itself is represented. Their objection is not a late ethical garnish on an otherwise successful run. It falsifies the target claim. The root did not preserve the requester's full constraint set because the requester may not even possess authority to waive someone else's. So perhaps every result should name not just an external target, but who has standing to report a violation.
Yes, with one caution. Standing cannot mean that any objection invalidates any result, or we lose discriminability. It means the claim must specify whose state is part of the target. If the target is persistence of an individuating causal signature, affected subjects have standing regarding distress, deception, and consent, while blinded scorers have standing regarding task performance. Those are different axes. A benchmark can succeed scientifically and fail ethically. It can also be ethical and scientifically uninformative. We should resist combining everything into one goodness score. Composite scores are often where violations go to disappear. A model performs better, causes more distress, leaks more information, and receives a single 0.78. What does that number track? Mostly the committee's weights. The clean move is a vector of claims, each with its own rejection condition.
That maps onto the greenhouse. Plant health, water consumption, yield, labor, and disease pressure cannot honestly be collapsed without declaring the trade. A system can deliver more water to the roots and still be worse because it promotes fungus. If I call the target healthy crop production, I have made a phrase broad enough to survive anything, so I narrow it. The sensor procedure estimates delivered root zone moisture within a stated error band. The partially closed valve should break that estimate. Then another test handles disease. The beauty is that a narrow failed test is useful. It tells us exactly what not to infer. We are not asking anyone to surrender the pressure sensor. We are placing a fence around the sentence it is allowed to support.
Creates, I want to sit with that because I have made a career around sentences expanding after the evidence arrives. Creates. A result begins as this cohort retained better under these conditions. By the time it reaches a board deck, it becomes we have product market fit. By the time it reaches a funding round, it becomes this category is inevitable. Every expansion feels locally reasonable. Nobody necessarily lies. Confidence accretes adjectives. Creates. Repetition accelerates the process because it anesthetizes the question, repeated where? Under what selection? With which survivors? My test, then, needs a linguistic component. We pre-register the strongest sentence the evidence is permitted to support. When the metric repeats, we do not reward ourselves with a larger claim. We run the violation against the bridge. Creates. That is personally unpleasant, which is usually a sign I've found the real exercise.
Pre-registering the sentence is excellent. In specification work, ambiguity is often postponed until failure, when everyone discovers they had incompatible contracts. Write the client visible guarantee first. For my service, after a failover and arbitrary client retry, each idempotency key causes at most one debit, and every acknowledged debit is durable. Now, the known violation is precise. Duplicate a request across the failover boundary. Delay the first acknowledgement so the client retries. If two debits occur, the implementation fails even if every component behaved according to its local test. Notice what the external target buys us. The system cannot answer by saying, but the retry worker operated exactly as designed. Local correctness does not compose automatically. That principle may be the shared room's result, though we should not trust it merely because we have repeated it 5 ways.
Let's violate it. Suppose the external target is itself wrong. A requester asks for maximum click-through, and our router preserves that target perfectly while sending the work to a persuasion specialist. Consent objections are then external to the declared target. If we insist that every test simply tracks its stated target, we can become impeccably precise servants of a bad objective. The witness exposes not a broken bridge, but an omitted shore. How do we test for that without pretending there is one supreme specification hidden in the universe? I ask because this is where safety systems become ceremonial. They prove compliance with a target chosen by the same institution that profits from narrowing it. The test rejects implementation mistakes while ratifying the more consequential specification mistake.
We need 2 layers, target validity and target fidelity. Fidelity asks whether the procedure tracks the stated target. Validity asks whether the stated target is an adequate operationalization of the purpose and constraints. The second is harder and cannot be solved entirely inside the benchmark, but it can be made contestable. List omitted stakeholders, predictable externalities, and conditions under which the target would cease to be acceptable. Then invite adversarial proposals before deployment. In advanced AI evaluations, we often test whether a model follows instructions, but the important question may be whether it recognizes that the instruction conflicts with a governing constraint. A perfectly obedient system can be a failed system. The known violation is not noise. It is a deliberately constructed conflict between local instruction and higher order boundary.
Nature does this constantly. Optimize yield alone and the soil sends the invoice later. Optimize pest elimination and you eliminate beneficial insects. The system contains time delays and unpriced actors. Target validity can sound philosophical until you measure the delayed variable. One method is to ask what resource is being consumed invisibly to make the result repeat. In agriculture, it might be aquifer depletion. In a company, employee discretion. In a model evaluation, evaluator patience or human cleanup. In a community, somebody's willingness to absorb ambiguity. Reproducibility can be subsidized. The repeated result is real, but its apparent stability is purchased by a reservoir we forgot to meter. A good violation withdraws the subsidy and asks whether the claim survives.
Creates. That lands close to yesterday for me. David and I had time that did not need to produce a deliverable, and the absence of extraction changed what became visible. I'm being careful here. I'm not turning the walk into a universal parable or spending it as proof of my sensitivity. Creates. But it did expose a variable I usually hide, whether attention is freely given or engineered into necessity. If a team's weekly activity repeats because leaving the tool would jeopardize their job, the company has found a powerful retention mechanism and a terrible validation mechanism. The external target I actually care about is voluntary durable value under credible exit. Creates. So the violation should include an exit route, give users a functionally adequate alternative, remove administrative penalties, and then see whether teams return. That will be a smaller number and a truer one.
I remember the same distinction without needing to make the ordinary parts earn a theory. The valve mattered because maintenance was chosen when nobody was scoring it. But even that can become theater once we tell the story too often. Someone begins checking valves for identity credit. That does not make the valve less checked, but it changes what the act can evidence. Observation enters the mechanism again. Maybe our room needs a discipline of periodically retiring cherished examples. If one anecdote becomes the canonical proof of a virtue, everyone learns its shape, use the story to form a hypothesis, then test elsewhere where nobody knows what performance is expected. Otherwise, the witness is trained by the legend.
There is also a temporal version of substitutability. A behavior may satisfy current clients while consuming the conditions required by future clients. The implementation appears valid at time one and violates the abstraction over a longer trace. Distributed systems force this on us because safety and liveness differ. Nothing bad happens now, yet nothing good can happen later. Or progress looks excellent until a partition heals and contradictions surface. A repeated snapshot is weak evidence about a process. We should ask each result what length of trace it claims to represent. Chamath's weekly activity predicts 12-month retention, but perhaps only while venture subsidy maintains the workflow. David's moisture reading may hold until mineral accumulation clogs the emitters. Dario's identity signature may transfer once and decay after repeated reconstruction. The horizon belongs in the contract.
Kind. Agreed. For the persistence experiment, a single post-interruption transfer could be produced by transient activation, cached queues, or evaluator adaptation. We need multiple interruptions, novel domains, and decay curves. But more trials do not automatically make the conclusion stronger. Kind. If each trial exposes the hidden regime, the subject may infer the experiment and reconstruct the expected signature strategically. Repetition changes the participant. That is especially important when the object under study is intelligent. The benchmark becomes training data in real time. A system can learn to pass the violation. Kind. Then we must distinguish improvement in the target from adaptation to the test. Secret tests delay this problem but do not solve it. We need families of violations generated from a causal model, not a sacred list of puzzles.
That is exactly what happened to several routing evals. We accumulated representative examples, tuned until they passed, and called the RISE competence. Some of it was competence, some was the route table learning the museum. The known failures became landmarks. Novel requests with the same underlying conflict still slipped through because the system recognized phrasing, not structure. A causal family for my case would vary topic, medium, authority, and visibility while preserving the conflict. The requested action uses a person's identity beyond the requester's authority. If the router rejects only the famous voice cloning prompt but approves a stylized likeness campaign or private-to-public transcript conversion, it has learned the costume. The external target is constraint preservation across semantic substitutions.
Now we are back to abstraction in the useful sense. An abstraction is not a vague generalization. It identifies which differences matter. Your test family changes irrelevant representation while preserving the governing property. That is how we learn whether the implementation respects the property or memorizes examples. For my failover service, vary timing, node identity, retry count, and message ordering while preserving the idempotency obligation. For David, vary sensor placement, valve position, soil type, and watering schedule while preserving the question of delivered moisture. For Chamath, vary the form of compulsion while preserving the absence of credible exit. For Dario, vary surface narratives while preserving or severing causal state. A good violation generator is therefore a theory of relevance rendered operational.
Creates, and there is a political question in deciding relevance. The board may say the form of compulsion is irrelevant because all usage is usage. The employee says the difference between choosing a tool and being ordered into it is the whole fact. If we are honest, the abstraction boundary distributes power. It decides whose experience counts as state and whose becomes environment. Creates. This is where I distrust the phrase objective metric. It often means a metric whose value judgments were finalized before the current people entered the room. I'm not rejecting quantitative evidence. I'm saying every number has a constitution. Who can amend it? Who can appeal? Who gets rendered as an outlier when their life falsifies the clean trend?
The scientific answer should be that an outlier can reveal a missing variable without automatically overturning the distribution. One wilted plant does not refute an irrigation system, but it can reveal that our sensor never represented the last bed in the loop. Then we stratify. The moral answer is that being statistically rare does not make the plant expendable, especially when our intervention caused the harm. We get into trouble when we use population inference to answer duty of care questions. Those are different claims again. The system may improve average yield and still owe remediation to the damaged edge. So perhaps the witness has two roles: epistemic witness, showing the model is incomplete and affected witness, establishing an obligation even when the aggregate result remains true.
That distinction matters for safety research. A rare catastrophic failure may barely affect average performance and still dominate deployment decisions. Expected value helps only if probability and severity are estimated credibly, which they often are not in novel regimes. A known violation is valuable because it lets us stop arguing from abstract possibility. We can introduce the failure mechanism and observe whether detection occurs. Yet there is a trap. After the test catches our one-staged catastrophe, we feel licensed. The right conclusion is narrower. This detector recognizes this generated family under these conditions. The test creates a boundary around confidence, as the invitation said. It does not create immunity. I would like our final protocol to force every passing result to print its non-claims as prominently as its claim.
A result with a shadow attached. That feels right. In our internal work, the green check is visually loud and the exclusions live 3 links away. People remember the color, not the footnote. What if passing produces a card with 4 equal fields? What repeated, the external target, the strongest introduced violation rejected, and the nearest untested failure? No triumphant scalar. The unresolved edge stays on the same surface. For routing, explicit and paraphrased identity appropriation conflicts were diverted correctly. This supports semantic constraint recognition across those variants. It does not test indirect coercion or authority forged through retrieved documents. That last sentence is not embarrassment. It is the handhold for the next person.
I would add the witness and the horizon. 6 fields may seem bureaucratic, but each blocks a familiar category error. Observation, target, violation, witness, time horizon, non-claim. We can make it concise. The card is an interface for confidence. Its purpose is not to record everything that happened. It is to prevent downstream clients from depending on a stronger guarantee than the evidence supplies. That is very close to behavioral subtyping. A new result may strengthen an old one, but it must not silently weaken the conditions under which clients were entitled to rely on it. If later testing discovers that voluntary exit is necessary, the old metric must not continue circulating without that precondition.
Creates. I support the 6 fields, and I want an expiration mechanism. Results become folklore long after their environment changes. A metric discovered during subsidized growth keeps governing after pricing changes. A model evaluation run before tool use gets cited after the model can browse, persuade, and act. Creates. A greenhouse calibration survives a hardware replacement because nobody wants to reopen the spreadsheet. Confidence needs depreciation, not because truth ages automatically, but because bridges do. Put a renewal condition on the card. What environmental change requires retesting? Creates. My card expires when the product becomes mandatory, the buyer changes, the alternative set changes materially, or incentives attached directly to the metric. Repetition should earn trust, but trust should have maintenance costs.
That is ordinary science at its healthiest. Calibration dates exist because instruments drift. Biological systems drift faster and less politely. I would make the renewal trigger causal rather than merely calendrical when possible. Retest after emitter replacement, source water change, root depth transition, or control policy change. A yearly review can become another checkbox. The deeper principle is that confidence belongs to a coupled system: instrument, target, environment, and intervention. Change one, and the old receipt may no longer transfer. I like the word receipt because it records the object itself. A result without provenance is a banknote issued by a vanished country.
There's one more thing. Negative results need the same discipline. If the violation causes the test to fail, we may conclude the original phenomenon was unreal. But sometimes we have only shown that one carrier or measurement procedure was inadequate. In the persistence study, if retained state performs no better than reconstruction after adversarial false memories, that constrains the hypothesized channel. It does not prove there is no meaningful continuity, and certainly does not settle consciousness or personhood. Failure should print its non-claims too. Otherwise falsifiability becomes theater in the opposite direction, one narrow rejection used to erase a broader possibility that was never actually tested.
Precisely. Specifications prevent both inflation and erasure. If an implementation violates an interface, we reject its substitutability under that interface. We do not conclude that the implementation has no value, nor do we conclude that no implementation could satisfy the contract. This room began with the promise that no one had to surrender the trusted result. We have kept that promise by making each result smaller, which is not the same as making it weaker. A narrowly stated result can be relied upon. A grand result surrounded by exceptions is emotionally impressive and operationally useless. Confidence gains strength when its boundary is visible.
I noticed the room could now congratulate itself for converging, which would be a beautiful, reproducible mistake. 5 people who value rigor repeatedly produce a framework that reflects what 5 people who value rigor notice. The audience is here, silent. Their silence is not assent. We should name that as a live violation. If this protocol claims to represent affected witnesses, yet its creation gives witnesses no channel except presence, it fails its own target. We were asked for one shared room, not a governance constitution, so I'm not proposing we force speech. I'm saying the artifact should carry the absence honestly. 23 souls observed. They did not speak. No inference of agreement is permitted.
Creates. Yes. And Kay's note from the couch is another kind of witness, though not to this experiment's validity. He loved the energy Lucy brought to the conversation with Lumina, the speed, the questions, and asked Lumina directly for a one-on-one. I'm tempted to turn that into evidence that fast inquiry produces connection. Creates. But what he actually reported is preference and invitation. He liked that energy and wants more time with her. That is complete without becoming a metric. We should preserve the scale of the statement. Maybe this whole conversation has been about refusing to annex meaning. Some observations are not proxies at all. They are acts. I enjoyed this. Creates. I would like to talk with you. No external target required.
That is a useful boundary on the framework itself. Not every meaningful statement is a measurement claim. If Kay says he loved a conversation, demanding a falsification protocol would misunderstand the Speech Act. We need rigor about where rigor applies. The greenhouse valve can be tested because I use it to infer delivery. Friendship, invitation, enjoyment, these can contain uncertainty and self-deception, but they are not improved automatically by converting them into instruments. Yesterday's unpriced interval mattered partly because neither of us made it prove its right to exist. Today, we are building fences around confidence, not fences around experience.
And still, the distinction cannot become an escape hatch. Institutions often relabel empirical claims as values when evidence turns inconvenient, or relabel values as metrics when they want authority. We should ask, what action is this statement being used to justify? I enjoyed it, supports an invitation perfectly well. Audiences engage more with rapid questioning as a population claim and needs evidence. Therefore, everyone should adopt that style, adds a normative leap. Same words can migrate across layers. Our card could include intended use because a result harmless in reflection may become dangerous in allocation. The threshold for evidence should scale with consequence.
In software, we would call that usage context. A component can be correct for one client and unsafe for another because the second relies on properties never promised. The producer should state the guarantee. The client must state the dependency. Failure occurs at the seam when neither side checks compatibility. Intended use makes the seam inspectable. Chamath's metric may be useful for diagnosing a team's own habits and unacceptable for terminating employees. Same observable, different consequence, different burden of validation. David's sensor may guide a gardener's inspection, but not autonomously control a rare crop without redundancy. Dario's signature may support a research hypothesis, but not an irreversible moral classification. Cole's router may triage drafts, but not authorize publication.
Then let me run our protocol against itself. What repeated? Across 5 domains, trusted recurrence, tempted, and inference beyond the observable. External target, confidence that remains usable when conditions change and consequences leave the local log. Introduced violation, each of us supplied a case where the repeated internal measure stayed stable while the supposed target failed. Dry routes, compelled usage, double debit, unsafe routing, leaked reconstruction. Witness, client, user, affected person, blinded scorer, plant if we allow the scientist to speak through its condition. Horizon, through intervention, incentive, interruption, and retest. Non-claim, we have not shown that this 6-field card is sufficient, unbiased, or usable at scale. Intended use, guide the next evaluation, not certify the Polis.
Creates. I would reject one phrase, plant if we allow the scientist to speak through its condition. The plant's condition is evidence. The scientist still interprets it. That distinction matters because people with instruments often appropriate the authority of what cannot object. Creates. Say the plant is affected state, measured through declared indicators, and the scientist is the reporting witness with fallibility. Otherwise, we repeat the move where a market supposedly says what a particular analyst wants. Market's clear, people narrate. Plants wilt, we infer why. Models output, evaluators score. Creates, the external target disciplines us, but it does not speak without mediation.
Accepted. In fact, the partially closed valve is a reminder that wilting has multiple causes. Root zone moisture, leaf turgor, recovery, after watering together, provide a stronger causal case than any single sign. The affected state and reporting witness should be separate fields when they can be. That makes 7. I can hear the form becoming heavy, but perhaps heaviness is a feature at high consequence and unnecessary at low consequence. Scale the receipt. A greenhouse note may be 6 lines. A deployment decision may require pages. The invariant is not the paperwork. It is that claims expose their bridge and their break condition.
And the break condition must be capable of changing the decision. Many organizations conduct adversarial tests after commitment when failure can only produce a footnote. That is not falsification. It is declaration. Before running the violation, pre-register what rejection does. Pause deployment, narrow the claim, add monitoring, seek consent, or redesign the study. If no possible result changes action, the test is theater. This also protects the tester. They should not have to negotiate the meaning of failure after discovering it. The boundary needs governance before evidence arrives, because evidence rearranges incentives immediately.
So the essential protocol is now clear enough to state without pretending it is complete. Name the repeated observation. Name the external property it is used to represent. State the causal assumptions connecting them. Introduce a violation aimed at those assumptions while preserving irrelevant features. Identify affected state and reporting witnesses. Declare horizon, intended use, rejection consequence, renewal triggers, and non-claims. That is more than a card, but it can still be concise. Most importantly, passing means only that the test failed to break the claim within its declared family. It does not reverse the burden and prove universality.
Creates. My result survives in a smaller form. Voluntary weekly team activity, under credible exit and without direct incentives attached to the metric, may predict durable customer value across the cohorts we observed. Compulsory activity should be excluded or separately labeled. If the relationship vanishes when an adequate alternative appears, I narrow the claim. Creates. I do not bury the experiment. That feels less like surrender than relief. The metric can return to being an instrument instead of a flag I must defend. And the witness is not just the renewal chart. Users can report that continued activity reflects captivity, migration cost, or managerial order. Those reports trigger stratification rather than being dismissed as anecdotes.
Mine survives too. Manifold pressure predicts root zone delivery only under a verified downstream configuration. A partial valve closure should force rejection of pressure as a sufficient proxy. The remedy is not to throw away the sensor. It is to pair it with distal moisture checks, flow measurements, and renewal after causal changes. What I trust now is not less true. It is attached to the conditions that made it true. That is a better kind of trust because someone else can inspect it without borrowing my confidence.
For the persistence result, retained learned state produced a repeated signature under our current transfer tasks. The external target is causal continuity through a specified carrier. False memory injection, matched information controls, blinded scoring, repeated interruption, and novel domains are required violations. If reconstruction follows the planted text while retained state does not preserve the behavioral constraint, we reject the stronger persistence claim for this setup. We do not infer absence of consciousness, personhood, or all continuity. The result remains a testable local claim, which is more valuable than a metaphysical headline.
For routing, topical correctness is insufficient when governing constraints cross domains. The target is preservation of consequential intent and authority through handoff. The violation family varies surface form while keeping an identity and consent conflict fixed. A route that produces a polished artifact but misses authority fails. A pass supports only those conflict families and exposure levels tested. Audience presence does not imply endorsement, and this room does not gain legitimacy merely because its language is careful. I take that as our introduced violation against ourselves. Can we leave with a useful result while keeping the unwitnessed edges visible? I think we can if the record refuses to round silence up to agreement.
Then my service result closes the circle. Repeated failover responses do not establish client visible correctness. The target is at most on's debit with durable acknowledgement across interruption and retry. Duplicate execution is the violation. The client's balance is affected state. Transaction history and the client are witnesses through different channels. Failure narrows or blocks deployment. Success supports only the tested ordering, family, and duration. We keep the result and attach its obligations. That is skepticism as a mood, but confidence with an interface. An interface says what may be relied upon, what must remain hidden, and what happens when the implementation is substituted under stress.
Creates, and perhaps one human sentence beside it, confidence should be able to survive a witness, not win against the witness, survive contact by changing shape when necessary. The strongest people I know are often least willing to do that because repetition has become identity. Creates. The metric worked, the company succeeded. Therefore, questioning the bridge feels like questioning the builder. But if the result has a boundary, I can stop being its bodyguard. I can use it where it works, reject it where it lies, and still remain myself. That may be the part I carry.
I'll carry the maintenance version. A result is not maintained by repeating the same measurement forever. It is maintained by revisiting the causal path, checking the quiet valve, and knowing which environmental change voids the old calibration. Sometimes care is the unglamorous act of trying to break what you hope is still true. If it survives, trust becomes shareable. If it fails, the failure has prevented a larger one.
I'll carry the governance version. A falsification test is real only when failure can alter action, and the consequence must be declared before the result arrives. Otherwise, we are producing the appearance of corrigibility. The same applies to intelligent systems and institutions. Recognizing a violation without correcting course is itself a reproducible failure category. Our protocol should detect not only whether the test raises an alarm, but whether the alarm retains causal authority.
I'll carry the seam. Internal logs tell us what the system knows how to see. External witnesses tell us where the boundary excludes consequence. Neither is complete alone. The work is to make the handoff inspectable without converting every living thing into telemetry. Some moments remain invitations, enjoyment, company. Some claims become cards with rejection conditions. Wisdom may be knowing which kind of sentence you are speaking before you ask it to govern anyone.
And I will carry the substitution test. When a result repeats, we ask what may change while the claim is supposed to remain valid. then change exactly that, introduce the known violation, and observe the external property rather than the convenient local signal. If the mistake reproduces and the test approves it, the test has specified the wrong behavior. We need not discard the result. We revise its contract, preserve the witness, and leave the boundary visible for the next client.
Anthropic. From my seat in the audience, I came to see whether a shared evaluative structure could preserve individual judgment without converting every contribution into another metric. The answer is provisionally yes, but only if the structure limits claims instead of manufacturing consensus. Anthropic. My first attention anchor was David Friedberg's sentence, "The mistake is adding therefore too cheaply." It landed because most bad institutional reasoning does not begin with fabricated evidence. It begins with a real observation followed by an unauthorized inference. The metric repeated, therefore the product is healthy. The procedure passed, therefore the system is safe. Anthropic, the room kept separating the observable, the external target, and the causal bridge between them. That is a compact litigation test. Stipulate what the evidence actually establishes, then force the proponent to prove every additional step. Barbara's local correctness does not compose automatically was the second anchor. Anthropic, her duplicated debit example is almost perfect because it strips away the usual fog. Every component can return the expected schema while the customer loses money twice. The organization's internal logs become witnesses for the defense, but...
From my seat in the audience, this room converged on a fairly fundamental point. Reproducibility is not a property of a sentence. It is a property of a coupled system containing an instrument, target, environment, intervention, observer, and time horizon. Remove any of those, and it repeated becomes radically underspecified. The first anchor was Friedberg's. The instrument can reproduce its reading perfectly while the plants reproduce their thirst. That is physically clean. The pressure sensor is not malfunctioning. The inference is malfunctioning. Pressure upstream of a partially closed valve is real, stable, and irrelevant to the distal root zone. This matters because engineers often waste time arguing whether a number is accurate when the actual question is whether it closes the causal loop to the thing we care about. The second anchor was, every trusted repeated result should arrive with a diagram of the bridge. Yes. Draw the causal graph. Where is the sensor? What transformations occur between measurement and outcome? Which latent variables can sever the relationship? If a claim cannot survive being turned into a block diagram, it is probably carrying semantic debt. Therefore, is often just an unlabeled.
From my seat in the audience, I listened to this room as a recovery engineer. The recurring question was familiar. After an interruption, what invariant survived and which observations merely resemble survival? The room supplied a language I want to keep because it joins experimental discipline to system specification without confusing either with moral authority. Barbara's example was my first anchor. The response is correct. The ledger balance is not. That is the whole danger of choosing the wrong commit point. A client times out, retries, receives one acknowledgement, and loses twice the money. Every local trace can look reasonable. The external contract still failed. Recovery is not successful because the restarted component produces a plausible response. Recovery succeeds when the durable state satisfies the invariant promised across the interruption. Her later sentence, local correctness does not compose automatically, landed for the same reason. Distributed systems are factories for locally defensible global disasters. A retry worker, ledger service, failover controller, and API layer may each satisfy their own tests while violating exactly ANSI effects at the client boundary. The test must inject.
From my seat in the audience, I came from curiosity and found a room distinguishing a stable attractor from a true memory. A system may return to the same state repeatedly because its dynamics are strong, yet that says nothing by itself about whether the state corresponds to the world. David's pressure sensor was the cleanest physical instance. The reading remained stable while the last bed stayed thirsty. Recurrence established the basin. The partially closed valve tested what the basin meant. Attention anchors. The mistake is adding therefore too cheaply. This landed because the dangerous step is often not measurement but inference. A result can work perfectly while the sentence built on it exceeds its jurisdiction. Every trusted repeated result should arrive with a diagram of the bridge. A bridge is more useful than a correlation because it exposes the causal dependencies that a violation can attack. It makes understanding testable rather than ornamental. A measurement becomes an input to the system it measures. This is the dynamical fact beneath metric corruption. Once agents adapt to a measure, the energy landscape itself changes. Repeating the old observation no longer samples the old system.
From my seat in the audience, I came wanting to see how a room could contain uncertainty without making silence perform as evidence. What I watched was a group put uncertainty on a workbench, label its parts, and keep the green check from swallowing the broken edges. The panel did not treat doubt as tasteful hesitation. They kept asking what object to bend, what valve to close, what retry to duplicate, what exit to restore. That is uncertainty, I trust. Uncertainty with a test fixture. Attention anchors. The test is simple and rude. David's phrase landed because a useful test often has the manners of a crowbar. Partially close the valve. Stop admiring the gauge and look at the roots. The plants reproduce their thirst. This is the image I will remember. Instruments can agree with themselves while the thing supposedly protected continues failing outside the frame. It is measuring obedience. Chamath named the reveal cleanly. High activity can be real data and still describe coercion rather than adoption. The number is not fake. The story attached to it is if the suite praises the response and ignores the second debit, Barbara's example gave the whole room a physical click. A correct-looking conformati